China just gave Canada something it has never offered the United States, and Washington found out through its own spy networks 36 hours after the fact. That is not a trade story. That is a power story. The mainstream media covered it as a minerals deal, a diplomatic reset, a goodwill gesture from a newly elected prime minister eager to diversify. But here is what nobody is telling you. This was not about minerals. It was about something far more consequential. It was about whether America's closest allies still feel bound to ask Washington's permission before making the most important decisions of their economic lives. They don't, and Canada just proved it. So ask yourself this. If a country as deeply wired into the American system as Canada can sign a framework agreement with Beijing on rare earths, on battery technology, on a 15-year supply guarantee, and absorb Washington's reaction without suffering any real consequences, what does that mean for every other resource-rich middle power that has been holding back? What does it mean for you living in a world being reorganized by decisions made in rooms you never hear about? Here is the number that should be on every front page but isn't. China controls over 85% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Not mining, processing. The part that actually matters. The part that turns raw material into the components inside every electric vehicle battery, every advanced semiconductor, every piece of military-grade electronics your government depends on. That means that right now, today, the most strategically important industrial inputs in the modern economy flow through a single country's hands. A country that has spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building that position deliberately, patiently, and with almost no serious competition from the West. That figure does not appear prominently in coverage of this deal because accepting it fully destroys the narrative that the West still controls the commanding heights of the global economy. It doesn't, not in this sector. And the Canada-China framework is the moment that fact became impossible to politely ignore. To understand why this offer was extraordinary, you need to understand how Beijing structures its most important economic relationships, because China does not treat all trade partners equally. It never has. At the base level, there are standard trade relationships. Goods move, tariffs are negotiated, companies invest. Transactional, unremarkable. Almost every country on earth has one of these with China. Above that sits a second category, comprehensive strategic partnerships. These involve coordinated policy alignment, technology cooperation, infrastructure investment, and access to Chinese industrial systems that standard partners never see. China manages these relationships carefully. Countries inside them receive treatment that countries outside them simply do not get. And then there is a third category, one that almost no Western country has ever been offered. Access to China's critical mineral processing infrastructure, its rare earth supply chains, and its next-generation clean energy technology. The assets Beijing spent 20 years turning into a near monopoly. The assets that represent China's primary lever of strategic power over the Western industrial world. For years, Washington tried to get access to that processing knowledge. The conversations went nowhere. Giving America preferential access to the technology and supply chains that constitute China's main strategic advantage over the West would be like handing your opponent your strongest card in the middle of the game. What China put on the table for Canada was a structured framework for joint development of rare earth processing technology on Canadian soil, using Canadian raw materials, Chinese industrial knowledge, and a governance structure that gave Ottawa meaningful control over the output. Not total control, but enough to matter. Enough to make the offer categorically different from anything Beijing had ever placed in front of an American negotiator. Imagine you own a building. You have one tenant who has been there for decades, pays a lot of rent, and over the years has quietly rewritten the lease terms in ways that increasingly benefit themselves. Now a new tenant comes to you not asking to replace the old one, but offering something different. A partnership, a facility in your building running on your raw materials, using technology you don't currently have, with a guaranteed contract for 15 years. You are not being asked to switch sides. You are being asked whether you are a landlord or a subsidiary. That is the question Canada answered on the 14th of March. Here is what most analysts say is happening. Canada, irritated by American tariffs and unpredictable trade policy, is looking to diversify its economic relationships. China, eager to expand influence in North America, sees an opportunity. The result is a minerals deal with some geopolitical symbolism attached. That reading is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. The first hidden layer is this. What Canada did is not primarily significant as an economic transaction, it is significant as a demonstration. A demonstration that the assumption of automatic Allied alignment, the idea that countries inside the American orbit will default to Washington's preferences on strategic economic decisions, is no longer a reliable operating premise for American foreign policy. The second hidden layer goes deeper. Washington cannot actually punish Canada for this in any way that doesn't immediately backfire. Sanctioning an ally is not a realistic option. Escalating tariffs on top of existing trade tensions carries political costs that spread far beyond the bilateral relationship. And publicly condemning a close partner for making a sovereign economic decision, however uncomfortable, is a position that every other American ally would watch very carefully before deciding how much independent latitude they themselves can claim. Washington has no clean response. And in the absence of a clean response, the signal becomes louder than any statement could have been. The rational choice logic here is straightforward. Beijing is not trying to pull Canada out of the Western alliance. It is trying to demonstrate in a specific, concrete, economically measurable way that the Western alliance does not operate as a monolithic bloc under American direction. Every time that can be shown to be true, the architecture of American-led economic dominance becomes slightly harder to maintain. Canada was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because of exactly what it is. Resource-rich, technologically capable, increasingly frustrated with the terms of its relationship with Washington, and led by a prime minister whose background in international finance gave him both the credibility to evaluate an offer of this complexity and the patience to pursue it without either panicking or overcommitting. You should subscribe to this channel. These analyses come out every day on the conflicts and decisions that are reordering the world while most coverage is still looking in the wrong direction. The groundwork for what happened in March was laid in January when Canada's Prime Minister made his first visit to Beijing in nearly a decade. Most coverage framed it as a diplomatic reset, a goodwill gesture, a signal that Ottawa wanted to diversify without committing to anything specific. That framing was not wrong. But alongside the public meetings and the state banquet, a separate set of conversations was happening in rooms no camera ever entered. Canadian officials were meeting with counterparts from China's Ministry of Commerce, its National Development and Reform Commission, and representatives of 3 state-owned enterprises directly involved in rare earth processing and clean energy technology development. Those conversations were exploratory. Both sides were testing seriousness. Beijing was assessing whether Canada had the political will to proceed with an agreement that Washington would view as a direct challenge to American supply chain strategy. Ottawa was assessing whether China was genuinely prepared to offer something substantive. By February, Ottawa had its answer. A Chinese technical delegation arrived quietly. No press release, no announcement. 4 days of meetings with officials from Natural Resources Canada, the Department of Innovation, and a newly created Critical Minerals Strategic Office. What the delegation brought was not a proposal. It was a framework. Detailed, technically specific, and structured in a way that immediately told the Canadian officials in the room that the preparation behind it had taken months, possibly longer. The framework covered 3 interconnected areas. First, a joint processing facility to be constructed in northern Ontario, combining Canadian lithium, cobalt, and rare earth deposits with Chinese processing technology. Second, a technology transfer arrangement covering specific stages of battery cathode manufacturing, knowledge China had never formally shared with any Western partner. Third, a preferential supply agreement guaranteeing Canada priority access to processed rare earth materials for its domestic manufacturing sector over 15 years. Each element alone would have been significant. Together, they represented something Canada's critical minerals sector had never had. A credible path to processing independence that did not require building an entirely new industrial base from the ground up over 2 decades. When the Canadian delegation arrived in Beijing in March, the document on the table was the formalized version of the February framework, refined, legally structured, and ready for a decision in principle. A yes or a no? The answer was yes. Washington found out through its own intelligence channels approximately 36 hours later. The phone call from Washington to Ottawa came within 48 hours. People familiar with that conversation described it as direct. American officials wanted to understand what Canada had agreed to, whether it was binding, and what it meant for existing North American critical mineral cooperation frameworks. Ottawa's response was equally direct. Canada had agreed to a preliminary framework. The details were still being worked through. And Canada's decisions about its own resource development and industrial policy were sovereign decisions that Ottawa would make based on Canadian interests in consultation with allies where appropriate, but not subject to an American veto. That last phrase was the one that landed hardest, not because it was aggressive, not because it was hostile, because it was simply a statement of fact, delivered calmly by a government that had clearly decided it was prepared to say it out loud. Here is the part that no coverage has properly connected. This is not primarily a story about a processing facility in Northern Ontario. It is a story about what happens when the assumption of automatic Allied alignment breaks down in a specific, measurable, economically concrete way. For decades, the architecture of Western economic strategy has rested on assumptions so widely shared that they were rarely examined directly. One of them was that Canada's resource sector was effectively part of the North American economic system, available to American industrial policy as a reliable input, unlikely to make independent strategic decisions that conflicted with American supply chain priorities. The March framework breaks that assumption in a durable way. Not because Canada is abandoning the Western Alliance. It isn't. Not because Ottawa has decided Beijing is a more important partner than Washington. It hasn't. But because Canada has demonstrated that it is capable of making economically significant decisions that serve Canadian interests, even when those decisions create friction with American strategic preferences. That demonstration matters enormously, not just for Canada. For every other resource-rich middle power watching how this unfolds. Australia has rare earths. Chile has lithium. Indonesia has nickel. All of them have been receiving similar approaches from Beijing for years. All of them have been hesitating because the assumption was that Washington's reaction would make the cost too high. Canada just changed that calculation. If a country as deeply integrated into the American system as Canada can say yes to a Beijing framework agreement and absorb Washington's reaction without catastrophic consequences, the threshold for every other middle power just shifted. The cost of saying yes to China got lower. The assumption of automatic American retaliation got weaker. Beijing's ability to make these offers and have them accepted just increased. That is the strategic multiplier effect hidden underneath every headline about minerals and processing facilities. One agreement in Ontario is not going to reshape the global rare earth industry, but the precedent that a close American ally can make independent strategic economic decisions involving China without being effectively punished for it, that precedent ripples outward in ways that are very difficult to contain once they begin. In 2 years, expect to see at least 2 other resource-rich middle powers formalize similar preliminary frameworks with Beijing. Not necessarily identical in structure, but similar in logic. The Canada precedent will have demonstrated that the cost is manageable. In 5 years, if the Northern Ontario facility moves through its regulatory and construction phases, Canada will have done something it has never had before. An industrial anchor in the critical mineral sector that is not dependent on American markets, American technology, or American political goodwill. A facility that gives Ottawa leverage in conversations it currently enters without any. A Canada with independent rare earth processing capacity is a structurally different negotiating partner than a Canada without it. It has options it did not previously have, and options in international relations are the only real form of power that persists across changing political seasons. In 10 years, historians will identify this as the moment when the assumption of Western economic solidarity as a reliably managed system began its formal disaggregation. Not because an alliance collapsed, not because a war was fought, but because a quiet yes spoken into a secure phone at night by a man sitting in a room with his trade minister and his national security advisor turned out to mean something larger than anyone in Washington had thought to prepare for. And here is the number I have kept for last. 0. That is the number of times Washington was consulted before the decision was made. Not because the information was hidden, but because the assumption that Canada would feel compelled to check in to request permission to subordinate a sovereign economic decision to American strategic preferences, that assumption was simply wrong. The 21st century is not won by the country with the most military bases or the loudest diplomatic voice. It is won by the country that understands which decisions are truly sovereign and has the patience and the positioning to make them when the moment arrives. Here is the question you should be sitting with. In a world where the rules of alliance, loyalty, and strategic alignment are being quietly rewritten in rooms you will never see, in languages you may not speak, over documents that will not appear in any newspaper for months or years, who is making decisions on your behalf? And are they making them for you or for someone else? The answer to that question, wherever you live, is the most important political question of this decade. A man said 3 words into a secure phone line at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. The city he was in was already asleep. The city on the other end of the deal was already moving on to its next meeting. And Washington, the city that assumed it would always know first, learned what had happened from its own satellites a day and a half later. That is the difference between performance and strategy. One needs cameras, the other needs patience, positioning, and 3 words spoken quietly into the dark.